Shireen Gorbani on the left.
John Dougal on the right.
And you're listening to Both Sides of the Aisle on Utah Public Radio, and we're
unsupervised.
So
let's have some fun.
Schedules have been a little more complicated these days, and we're still trying to get all three of us together. I want to give a shout out to two listeners. We got an email from Andy. And we received an email from, I think, Deanna. And I just really want to say thank you for listening. We so appreciate that you spend your time with us. We try to be reflective and thoughtful. We got some nice feedback on some of the things that we had shared in the last episode. And I'll just also add that, one of the comments that we got was about ranked choice voting, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later today, too.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great. So it is... Wow, the weather changed quickly. So we're recording on a snowy day.
Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah. So wait.
Feels like winter is here.
It was like
Tuesday. Tuesday.
Oh my goodness.
It's Tuesday. What day is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Time's flying.
Time is flying. It feels like it's been 10 years since we were last together. But we certainly have some
And it was 60 degrees over the weekend.
It was 60 degrees over the weekend. We certainly have some, I think, national news that's also made it feel like we have lived for lifetimes. So let's...
And the votes aren't done being counted yet.
The votes are not done being counted yet. So can you give a little kind of overview of what we think we know, kind of big trends or big things that you're seeing here?
Well, clearly Trump has the White House, and I would say that it was a landslide. When you look at the Electoral College vote, over 300, it was a landslide for him. The Republicans control the Senate. They're in the process of working to choose a majority leader, and so that'll be interesting. And right now we're on the cusp. The Republicans have 215. They need 218 to maintain control of the House. We don't yet know, but it looks like the Republicans are also going to control the House. So it looks like Republicans basically ran the tables, and they are going to control or both houses of the legislature as well as the executive branch.
Yes. And the Supreme Court, where they have inserted a number of Republicans and may have another opportunity to do so. I hope not, but we have. So I think in large part, our certainly top court leans very right. We're seeing this across, the House, the Senate, and the White House. I guess maybe I'm feeling philosophical because it feels sort of gray out there, but John,
what kind of Zen thing should you take from this election?
I guess I would. Well, I think that is going to have to wait for me for a moment, in part because, and we're thinking part of our strategy for continuing to sustain this show through the holidays is we sometimes record shows in advance. And I think between now and the holidays, we'll have more data and we'll be able to go into looking state
results
by
will come
state.
in. We'll start having most things canvassed and certified. And
and down to a much finer grain detail. And we'll be able to see, I think we're hearing some trends now around working class voters. What is, well, let's talk about that. What is that? Like, we'll have these conversations so listeners know that we're not just kicking this can forever down the road, but like in short order, you'll hear our thoughts on this. But I think it's important for us, and I feel really committed to taking time to getting better information before we start speculating on kind of all of the things that this says. But what we do know is I guess I'll add two pieces of brightness from, I guess, my side of the aisle. We did have Ruben Gallego beat Carrie Lake, election denier Carrie Lake
for the
down
Senate.
in Arizona. And then we also had Nevada.
Let's talk about Arizona real quick.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Okay. Trump wins in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Gallegos, Democrat, wins statewide.
Yeah.
And abortion.
Does above 60. Yeah.
Above 60%.
Yes.
So it's kind of an interesting, people voted one way and then voted another way and voted another way. And it's just kind of interesting to see they didn't just lock in on a certain philosophy or a certain candidate and so forth.
Do you think that's a sign? Do you read that to be about the quality of candidates, the potency of the issue, the sense of just maybe people becoming less partisan? Like, what's your read on that?
My read on that is I think Trump winning, there was a certain message there. People knew who he was. They knew what he stood for. They knew his background. They knew all the issues that were out there, and yet they still voted for him, saying, to me, they were not happy with the Biden administration. They weren't happy with whatever vision Kamala was trying to pitch, and they wanted to repudiate that when it came to the White House. But when it came to the Senate, they were more willing to say, I'm okay having somebody counterbalance in the Senate and not just going lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah.
And clearly there were folks that voted for Trump, that voted in favor of the abortion
initiative
down there.
Yeah.
And there were clearly many folks that didn't vote for Trump and voted for it. And so it was, you had some crossover down there where you're voting for Trump. And I think part of the message there for Trump was clearly Kamala was campaigning on that issue.
Yeah.
But it didn't carry for her in Arizona. But I think some folks said, he says it's a local issue. Mm-hmm. And so, I appreciate it's a local issue. I'm going to vote for this initiative because I don't think he's going to push something at the federal level.
Yeah. Well, I do think get ready for probably a 15-week or lower national ban. That has been something J.D. Vance has promised numerous times, right, under the guise of calling it a minimum national standard, which is a ban. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I guess I would add this. I think as much faith as I have in people and as much as I do believe, like certainly listeners to a show like this are deeply in it, educated, care about local politics, care about politics more broadly. I think one of the more interesting sort of graphs or charts that I saw in the last week was how many people Googled what a tariff is in the wake of Trump's win. How many people Googled Project 2025? I think most people, I appreciate your sort of suggestion that they knew what they were voting for. I think they knew that they were unhappy with current status quo, right? They were unhappy with the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. And Natalie's talked about how the reality that people are living versus what numbers are actually telling us are a little out of sync, right? So inflation's down, the economy is on the rise.
The whole thing. Yeah, perception is reality.
Perception is reality. But I do think that there's certainly a global trend of the parties in power losing power in this moment with the inflation that people have experienced and the real hardship that people have. But I would also just say that I think that there is a real lack of knowledge about what a second Trump administration is, the tenor, tone, and actual policy promises of it. And I do think it's going to be a rude awakening for people who are just sort of in the throw the bums out kind of mentality when we're starting to talk about the resurgence of family separation, mass deportation is being promised. I think many people, I know certainly folks in Utah were very distraught over children being separated from families and kept in detention facilities at the border. There were many horrific elements of the immigration policy that the Trump administration ushered forward last time. And I think this time there's a sense that will be even more extreme. So I hope that people pay attention and don't check out.
And will that be more extreme because of what Trump did, or because of, or is going to do, or because of what Biden has allowed to happen under his administration, or kind of a combination of both?
Combination of both potentially, but I would just add that border crossings are down significantly. They've been down over the last many months, actually. But that's not the story that was told.
Over the last many years.
Sure. And, I think for me, it feels like a moral offense when we're thinking about folks that have been here a long time, when we think about folks who are simply working to try to make a better system. And I know that we agree on wanting to see actually a much more comprehensive and dynamic response to immigration.
And to actually see it fixed.
To see it actually fixed.
Address it, Congress.
But in a few moments, I'm just wondering if you can speak on behalf of your party. What do you hope to actually see? What do you think about when I look at the list of folks that are being nominated for top positions? I'm worried about far-right extremist ideas. I'm worried about increasing costs for everyday Americans. I'm worried about an education system that is already failing to be even further defunded. What kinds of things are you looking at and hoping for when you see this administration and this opportunity?
So what I am hoping for is, first and foremost, and unleashing and getting the federal government off the back of the American people and letting them better control their lives, their businesses, and so forth. And so that's one of those that I'm hopeful, and we'll have to see. In the previous Trump administration, there were some aspects, it absolutely was that way. And there are other aspects with tariffs and so forth that were not that way. And so it was somewhat a mixed bag, but economically, people felt like pre-COVID, things are going great. Things are generally quite good. And I think a lot of folks are hoping that we go back to that. When it comes to other situations, and we'll probably talk some about cabinets, but Trump is going to appoint a lot of folks to run these different agencies. I hope we see less regulation in the agencies. I hope we see those agencies get pushed more out of D.C. into local areas. You look at, Interior Department. Okay, how much do they really, truly understand the situations in the West or in Utah versus living in D.C.? And I hope more of that gets pushed out across America so that they better understand the results of their regulations.
Yeah.
So That's what I see. I'm hopeful that we will go down a path of dealing with the debt and balancing the budget. I'm not very
prior experience suggests.
I'm not optimistic there, but I'm hoping that we do that. When we look at national defense, this is one of those mixed bags. I come from a perspective which is, how do we have a strong national defense, but not engage in nation building? And that will be a question: is how will Trump engage? I know Trump his words are he wants to be less engaged in nation building and doesn't want to be in so many wars or proximity wars. But that's one of those questions. What will shake out? And what you look and see right now today may be very different than what we actually see in a year or two.
Yeah.
Certain global situations, events will occur that will alter one's perspective of how to respond.
Yeah. I'll just also try to remind people that the previous Trump administration was a real revolving door. People did not stay in some key positions very long. There was a lot of turnover in, for example, Attorney General. When you think about Chief of Staff, right? Like that, those kind of closest to him are different this time. So I'm curious too if there will be like the family doesn't seem like it's going to be inserted into the White House. You may remember his children were, given office space right next to him. It seems like that's different this time too.
I think last time he wasn't necessarily expecting that he'd win.
Yeah.
So he was flat-footed in terms of getting a jump out of the blocks. And so a bunch of his family was helping with kind of all these activities.
Yeah.
Where right now, I mean, I think he's been thinking. And you've seen names that have already been announced for various positions. And it looks like he's jumping out of the blocks to start to fill his cabinet and start to fill these key positions in his administration.
Yeah.
And it looks like they're all loyalists.
They are loyalists. And so I think what ultimately that means, like just to paint a picture for folks, and maybe in the next segment, we'll just talk through like, what is the cabinet? What are the seats that are around the table? What are those key agencies? And some that have been announced in terms of appointments in that space. But when you have loyalists around you, I think that when we think about kind of the unchecked power, the ways in which Trump is a traitor to this country, felt very comfortable, saying things like, we're going to basically rip up the Constitution. To have people around you that are loyalists, to me, also feels like a very challenging, I guess would be a kind way to put it, time for this country. Because having a bunch of yes men around a person who wants unchecked power feels dangerous to me.
This is one of those things. Your loyalty should first and foremost be to the Constitution as you drive the principal's agenda.
Yeah.
And that's the question is, to what extent will the principal's agenda override anything and everything?
Yeah, that's right.
But you've seen a couple folks that were clearly, pointedly not going to get appointments. Nikki Haley.
Ron DeSantis.
Mike Pompeo.
Yeah.
Clearly, Trump came out and said they will not be in the administration.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do wonder, too, if we think about Trump as being motivated quite largely by a vendetta, what does it look like? What does it look like for the average American person? Because I do continue to believe this is not a president who cares deeply about the average American person. I think that this is largely about ego and those who have wronged him. So what will it look like on a broad scale to enact a presidency that's wrapped around the notion of retribution?
Well, this is one of the things that will be a question, which is oftentimes he has a lot of bluster with what he says, and he doesn't really follow through with what he says. And so the question will be, will he follow through? Right. Or is it just bluster and it's going to go by the wayside and he's going to focus on other issues?
Right. And I mean, I say it jokingly, but you remember Infrastructure Week, which was coming every week of the Trump administration and actually arrived when Biden came into office. But you're listening to Both Sides of the Aisle, and we'll be back after this break to talk a little bit more about local news and a bit more about transitions. You're listening to Both Sides of the Aisle on Utah Public Radio. We love to hear from listeners like you. If you would like to send us a comment, email bsotapodcast@gmail.com. That's bsotapodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Shireen Gorbani on the left.
John Dougal on the right.
And we're unsupervised again this week as we are coming together to reflect on some kind of big themes that we know out of the national election, but also moving down here to the local election. So I just want to throw out a couple of things. We said we would kind of talk a little bit about cabinets. I'm hoping that in a future episode we can have a deeper dive with Natalie because she worked for somebody who was in a presidential cabinet, right? So when we talk about Mike Lovett. So it is includes the VP and then 15 other departments. I'll just throw out a few of them here. We have the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education.
If you have these on your bingo card, mark them right now.
Mark them right now. Secretary of State, where we have the announcement that Marco Rubio is likely to be in this role.
Out of Florida, senator out of Florida. Yeah. That'll be interesting. He's a son of Cuban immigrants.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Labor, Interior, on and on, Attorney General. And there's a little bit of talk that maybe Mike Lee may be considered for this role.
Mike Lee is one of those names.
Yeah. So anything that you're seeing on this list that's jumping out that is of interest to you?
Well, it's interesting from my perspective how quickly he started announcing names. Mm-hmm. Clearly, these folks have to go through Senate confirmation, which will happen once he's in office, and that will take a little bit of time to just work through that process. Clearly, when these folks, Marco Rubio, you'd have to replace him in the Senate. I think Florida's going to go with a Republican there. Elise Stefanik
has been selected as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Yep. And so, but I think her House district went overwhelmingly Republican. And so as he looks to appoint folks to these positions, there's also that look to see, okay, is this going to change the balance of power in the Senate or the House, and making sure that the Republicans don't lose control of either of those bodies in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are these kind of other interesting ones that are standing out to me. As a foreign policy hawk, Representative Mike Waltz has been selected as National Security Advisor. So this is where actually I think there's a little bit of tension here. So when we think about kind of the Trump there is no Trump doctrine, right? Like when we think about what is the approach to foreign policy, it is quite, from my perspective, it's cozy up to dictators and see what happens. But I think that there is...
And I think Republicans would say, avoid war and get us out of war.
Okay. There's quite a bit of tension, I think, between somebody who maybe really sees themselves as a hawk, a person who's maybe more inclined to engage in war, and what the Trump administration has said publicly. So how that plays out is interesting to me. Governor Kristi Noem out of South Dakota as Homeland Security Secretary. This feels like a real stretch in terms of skills.
Yeah, that's an interesting announcement right there.
Yeah.
Clearly, she was a loyalist in this process, but I'm not sure what her experience is when it comes to Homeland Security.
Right. So
and Homeland Security is one of those organizations that is a behemoth coming out of 9/11, and I think it's significantly broken. Secret Service reports in there, and there's lots of problems, as we know, with that organization.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that.
And one of the key things you mentioned, secretary, and this is not secretary in the normal sense that we think of somebody who's just a low-level employee who helps the boss.
What an interesting characterization of secretary.
No. But I think for some folks, they hear this term and think, no, these folks need to buy into the agenda. They need to toe the message within organizations. And if you're trying to change, whether you want to call it the deep state or the bureaucracy or whatever it might be, they have to have the leadership, the vision, be able to communicate the staying power to drive the change that the president expects.
Yeah. And okay, so I'll just say there are some places where I feel like I can warm up to your argument around deregulation. But then I think about things like labor. Mm-hmm. And I think about the really important labor protections that we have. I think about the environmental protections that we have that keep our drinking water. Not everywhere in this country, but in most places has kept our drinking water safe and clean, has kept our air, at least in Utah, breathable most days. When we think about regulation and how regulation impacts broad scale safety in this country, I am really concerned about a highly deregulatory environment also creates some chaos and can create really dangerous situations for workers, for people who breathe, for people who drink water, which I think is most of us.
We'll have to do a survey on that and find out. No, but one of the things I'm going to say is when you talk about regulation, to a certain extent, what I hear is the government is now dictating when you can pollute.
Yeah.
And so government regulation, as you're highlighting what you believe is the good aspects of it, I also see the harms. That is, okay, you can pollute the water this much, not more, but this is what's allowable. And you can pollute the air this much. And all of a sudden there's this negotiating and jockeying of who gets to pollute in what way and who doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, we all want clean air. We all want clean water.
No, we don't.
Well, I think substantially, we want that.
Forces at play do not, we'll say.
But we sometimes impair the liability, the responsibility for whether it's individuals or corporations, whatever it might be, to make sure that they really, truly are held accountable for their polluting. And unfortunately, the federal government has been one of the worst polluters when you look at many decades. You go back into the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, major significant pollution concerns as a result of our own federal government.
Okay. I guess I would just say that I think get ready for it to be easier to pollute, for it to be easier to exploit workers. I think one of the places I'm really concerned about this, it comes to the way technology, innovation is protected, shared. When we think about intellectual property, deregulation could have large spillout effects that highly challenge our national security.
So let me ask you a question. When you talk labor issues,
yeah,
I mean, different states have, all the states regulate labor to a certain extent.
Sure.
So to what extent is this redundant? We've got federal and state agencies both kind of somewhat overlapping in terms of this regulation. Why, from your perspective, can't this just be left to the states?
Okay, so what you're saying is you're not deregulation, you're not pro deregulation, you're pro regulation at the state level.
Well, there's a whole bunch of things that I think happen at the federal level that, if they're going to happen, I think are better suited at the local level. And that might be state, that might be city level, might be school district level, but there are some things I think we're going to regulate. I just don't think we need to regulate them at the federal level. So clearly, there's other aspects I just don't think we should regulate. Yeah.
So I guess I would say this. I think that we are already living in an environment where somebody growing up in a zip code here has a fundamentally different trajectory, access to, everything from the quality of the air they breathe to the books they're allowed to read, all the way to decisions they may be able to make about their own health or well-being, right? The access they may have to guns, for example, right? All of that. To me, it seems that there should be a way for us to move to a notion that there's a minimum standard in this country that allows us to breathe clean air or to not be exploited beyond a certain level. When we think about the kinds of people that gain access to power over and over and over again, working class people, immigrants are left out for all sorts of reasons. When we think about barriers based on citizenship or language, the people who have power to bend the laws to their benefit versus those who are most directly impacted by it, the gap between those is huge to me. So it makes sense that we would have a protective approach from a federal government. I could be persuaded on fine grained details. I could be. But when I think about the exploitation, the level of exploitation for profit in this country, for people who are the most vulnerable, I'm very worried about an administration as unhinged as this one is looking to be.
Okay. And what I see is sometimes that floor you talk about actually becomes a ceiling. Mm-hmm. And so rather than being the safety net that kind of helps make sure nobody goes below, it almost becomes nobody can go above.
Yes.
Or only the privileged get to go above and everybody else is capped at that point.
So I know that we spent a lot of time on these national issues.
Should we talk local?
Yeah, let's talk local just briefly because you have a little bit of an announcement.
Last week it was announced that I am helping co-chair the transition team for AG-elect Derek Brown.
Yeah.
And so we have 11 different subcommittees on an array of different aspects within the Attorney General's office and topics and 40 plus volunteers. And it's pretty exciting to help him. Derek's been a good friend of mine since we served together in the legislature. Very optimistic about him and his administration. So I'm honored to be able to help him with that.
Yeah.
And part of my job is logistics and coordinating all those moving parts.
So if people have ideas about the Attorney General's office, they should contact you.
Certainly.
A direct line.
Or Derek as well.
And I'll just say that we still actually have a number of votes that are still coming in. Not massive. Mostly it's settled. Something that stood out to me in the news was that Donald Trump received more of the vote share than Governor Spencer Cox. What stands out to you about that? More votes were cast for Trump than for Cox.
Well, clearly there was a lot of infighting in the Republican Party about the governor's race. You had Governor Cox and you had Representative Lyman as a write-in. And so there's a lot of squabbling in there. I think the other dynamic is, to a certain extent, Democrats are more willing, there are certain independents are more willing to vote for a Democrat for governor in Utah than willing to vote for a Democrat for president. So that also plays into it.
Yeah, I think there's a part of it there. So it looks now, and again, these numbers will change, but just over 50,000 more votes were cast for Trump than for Cox. And that
the last election, I beat both the president and the governor. It was, as auditor, it was kind of an interesting dynamic.
Interesting.
You don't expect that.
So maybe it's because you got to put frugal on the ballot. But I'll just say there are really interesting state level. So our legislature looks to kind of stay the same. Dynamics look to be largely the same.
Senate has some new leadership on the Republican
Senate has
side.
new leadership on the Republican side. Can you give a shout out to who that is?
Well, yeah. So you've got Stuart Adams continuing as president. You got Kirk Cullimore, who's stepping up to majority leader. You've got Senator Wilson up in Cache County as a majority whip. And you've got Mike McKell.
So I will just say what that does is shift back to being, I believe, full in the Senate, full male representation. We do have a female Republican leader out of the House. That is a very different picture for Utah Democrats. But we'll get into the fine-grained details of these races at the local level, things that you're maybe seeing at county levels, and then also leadership in our state in our next week's episode. So thank you so much for listening. I'm Shireen Gorbani.
John Dougal.
And you've been listening to Both Sides of the Aisle. Our producer is Anthony Scoma. Thanks for tuning in.